Hey, Gracie, how are you?
I'm great, Rick. How are you today?
Good, good. Good to see you again.
Yes, you as
Yeah,
well.
good. What's our topic today?
Great. Um, I've heard you talk about the STAR model, which is a,
Okay.
a model for organization design and alignment. And
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can go over the 5 points of that STAR for us today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So let me give you a little context and background. The STAR model is one of the earliest organization design models that's still in use today. This was developed by Jay Galbraith back in the 1960s. Jay remained very active for, gosh, 50 years doing organization design and development. He's really a renowned both theorist as well as practitioner. You might remember back in the 70s and 80s hearing the term matrixed organization. Well, Jay's the person who coined much of that. I had the pleasure of meeting with Jay and working with him on one of his last projects back in 2013. So the STAR model is much like what we've talked about, the Don and Sandra Jules alignment model and David Nadler's congruence model. These are all about defining components of an organization, particularly from the perspective of a CEO, and finding ways to align them. So the five components of the STAR model are the strategy, the structures, the processes, the rewards, and the people. So, Gracie, the first component I'd like to talk about, and the one that you traditionally start with any alignment model, but in particular with Jay's model, is strategy. And so, what's strategy? So, strategy is really defining the company's formula for winning, for creating competitive advantage, for beating the competition. And what are the elements of strategy, at least in Jay's definition? It's the goals and objectives, the specific goals and objectives that you want to achieve, as well as the values, mission, and purpose of your organization. So these things define and set out the direction for your company. It's typically the first component that needs to be defined because all of the other points of the star really emerge from the direction that you want to take the company. What are you trying to achieve with this company? I experienced this firsthand with the project that I worked with Jay on when we went in to do an international organization design, creating country presidents and aligning them with the corporate headquarters here in the U.S. But what Jay found was there was a missing element. They weren't clear about their direction. They weren't clear about uh, how they wanted to compete in each of these countries and how that was different than we were doing business here in the US. So we actually took a step back and did a 3-day session around strategy development, which then allowed us to proceed with the organization design. So, why is that important? Well, if you think about it, the structure, the form of the organization is what enables you to accomplish certain activities, to get certain work done, or provide certain services, produce certain outcomes. And so, how you structure the organization is going to let you do um, whatever it is your goal and objective is. And so, understanding your strategy, what you're trying to achieve, is the first step in understanding what kind of an organization do we need to create to achieve the products or services we're trying to produce. Your strategy is defining the activities that are most necessary, which in turn defines the trade offs you have to make in the design process. Now, what Jay found was some organizations wanted to have their cake and eat it too. It wasn't either or, it was both and. We need to be able to produce this product and provide this level of customer service. How do we do both those things? And that's where the matrixed organization really emerged. So, a matrix structure is when you have two or more activities that you're trying to accomplish, and you don't want one hindering or preventing the other. And so that's when you started to see companies not just producing widgets, but producing widgets and working with customers to implement those widgets in a very effective way and provide service to that customer. The next point of the star is structure. And Jay defines this in a fairly traditional way. It's really the power and authority of the organization. And he defines it in 4 subcomponents. So I want to cover each of those if I could. The first is what is specialization? And that's the type and number of job specialties that are necessary to perform the work. And so if we're trying to produce a certain product or provide a certain service, what are the specific organization capabilities, individual competencies necessary to get that work done? And so that's defining the specialty areas and the number of people that you need to have in each of those areas. The second area of structure, Jay calls the shape. And that's the number of people constituting each department or the span of control. And that's at each level of the organization. And so typically you want to minimize your number of layers. And so that usually means what is the greatest span of control I can have at each layer of the organization that is still reasonable for someone to be able to manage. And you'll see this a lot in healthcare. I worked a lot in healthcare. And so the question is, how many patients on a floor can a nurse reasonably work with? And that's the span of control for the nurse, which dictates how many nurses we need on that floor. So that's what Jay calls the shape of the organization. The third area of structure that Jay talks about is the distribution of power. And usually we talk about power distribution in the vertical. So you'll hear us talk about verticals and horizontals. Verticals are typically P&Ls or separate business lines, but it's how you're measuring the performance of the organization. And the distribution of power, it's the classic issue of what's centralized and what's decentralized. Forming laterals or horizontals is moving power across an organization or department. And that's when we think about finance, IT, HR, compliance, supply chain, is usually functions or horizontals that work across the organization versus verticals, which are your P&Ls. And so that's the more traditional distribution of power. Who owns the P&L and who owns the efficiency and effectiveness of one functional area? And the fourth component of structure that Jay talks about is a long, complex word, departmentalization. And that's short for saying you got to form departments. And so at each layer of this organization, you have to have a certain structure or number of departments. Again, think of a hospital. So in a hospital, you'll have a chief nurse who often is responsible for all of the nursing provided in that hospital, but you probably will divide it by floor. Sometimes you may even have 2 departments on a given floor. And so the departmentalizing the organization is the fourth component of structure. And that's all about, what functions, products, workflow is necessary. So Gracie, any questions about those first 2, strategy or structure?
I don't think so. It's super clear. And I thank you for providing the specific example of healthcare, because thinking about it in terms of those departments and how many patients is really helping to make that tangible.
Great. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Let's talk about the third point of the star, and that's processes. And so there are many different processes that are necessary. Typically, it's about information sharing, and decision making that that cut across the organization. So, as you think about that, management processes are both vertical and horizontal, right? And so, what are some of the vertical management processes we have in place? Well, if I own this P&L, I run this hospital, and I need to know what are the performance expectations for the hospital as a whole, and are we going to achieve those? So setting the KPIs for that P&L, that vertical, and then there are also horizontal metrics that we're going to have, and expectations that we may have as a healthcare company for all of our hospitals. If I have 10 hospitals or 10 P&Ls, what are our expectations around the finance systems we want to put in place or processes, the HR policies and processes, the IT processes. And so as you look at an organization, you're having processes that are necessary to manage verticals, to manage horizontals, and then in the matrix structure, you see where those things come together in a given node. Now, there are increasingly organizations moving to networked organizations. Sometimes you'll hear adaptive teams. And what those are about is providing the necessary information so that these teams that can evolve and change and morph, essentially, in order to meet a client need, can pull from the information and decisions processes that are in place for the company as necessary to meet that specific client need. So we've kind of evolved away from the verticals and horizontals and matrix structures, and increasingly you're seeing these networked organizations. Probably the easiest example for that, Gracie, is a large consulting firm. And so a large consulting firm may have a project with a specific client. And so whoever the project lead is for that project with that client has this wealth of human talent, this wealth of database and processes that they can pull from for that specific client need. So it's really probably some of the early examples of adaptive teams were in major consulting firms as they were trying to meet specific client needs. The fourth point on the star are rewards. And you think about, so what's the purpose of a reward system? Well, it's really to align the goals and ambitions and desires, expectations of the employee with those of the organization. So typically we think about policies around salaries, promotions, succession, other forms, bonuses, profit sharing, stock options, equity in the company. These are all of the reward systems that are really quite important and need to be aligned with the kind of organization you're creating. What are you incenting? Are you incenting individuals to deliver just individual productivity, or are you incenting a team for team productivity? And you can do both. You can have structures in place that incent both the individual performance as well as the team or collective performance. So all of the reward systems become a really key part of your organization design. The fifth point of the star are the people, and these are ensuring that you've defined, in order to deliver a product and service, what are the organization capabilities necessary, and then in your organization design, you identified what are the specialty jobs necessary, which means what are the individual competencies our people need to have. So all that's been defined in your structure. And now you take that and you say, we need to have ways to recruit the right people, to select the right people for those roles. We need to look at their growth and development, whether that be through rotating them to give them different experiences, formal training programs, either inside the company or outside of the company, development, other development like a boss coaching their employees. So these human resource uh, policies and procedures are really important to generate the kind of skills and mindsets necessary to achieve your strategic direction given the organization structure that we just put in place. So those are the five components, and I got a couple more things I'd like to discuss, Gracie, in terms of the implications of the STAR model. But before I go there, any comments or questions about what I've covered so far?
I think that's great, Rick. Yeah, thanks so much.
Great. Well, at least I'm making sense. So thank you.
That's right. That's all we can hope for.
Yeah. Um, so, what are some of the implications of the STAR model? Um, as I mentioned, you see us going from the traditional hierarchy to matrixed to more networked, agile, adaptive organization. So, as the business environment is changing more and more rapidly, these alternative structures become um, really important. And guess what? That means all the other points of the star need to be able to move in a much more fluid way. Back in the 60s and 70s, you built a manufacturing plant and it was probably good for 5 or 6 years, pretty static. And your objective was efficiency and effectiveness and cost reduction. And in 5 or 6 years, you're going to have a car change. And restructure the factory and look at all of these components. Now it's happening on the fly all the time. So, knowing what these 5 points of the star are and how they interface becomes really, really important. And the same from a strategic perspective. So, given the rapid pace of change in our business environment, it means strategies. People talk about 3 to 5 year strategies, and for many companies, it's worthless. That you're looking at much shorter term strategies, and what kind of organizational um, alacrity do we have to adapt to those necessary strategies? And that one size doesn't fit all. Different strategies require different kinds of organizations. Another implication of the STAR model are the lines in between all the points. So it's the interweaving of each of the points of the star. And so that as the structure changes, the processes, rewards, and people need to change. As the rewards are put in place, that's going to have an impact on the other parts of the system, all of which drive um, uh, the organization to look at, do I have the right strategy in place? And then the final item I'd like to talk about, Gracie, and you can put the slide up that speaks to this. It's an outcome of the organization. So what Jay is saying is, as managers, as leaders, we can make choice around strategy, structure, processes, rewards, and people. These are things that we can make choice around. But one of the things that emerges out of the way in which those things are aligned is behavior. And so people's behavior is shaped by the organization structure. I like to talk about the hardware shapes the software, in this case, shapes people's behavior. And what's behavior really all about? Well, it's two things. It's about individual and collective performance, and it's about the culture. And so the kind of culture that you're creating is greatly shaped by the kind of organization and organization design that you've put in place. So those are just a few things that I've used Jay's material now for many years, and have seen the power of keeping these elements in mind. And one of the things that I think Jay does differently than others is the emphasis on the reward structure. He actually makes that one of the components. In other models, it's one of the processes you have to consider, and Jay breaks that out and emphasizes that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so thank you, Gracie. I appreciate your patience.
Oh, of course. Thanks so much, Rick.
Okay, thank you.